What's going on, everybody? D here from perfecthumanx.com, and today I'm going to be talking about subcutaneous injections of Dianabol. If you know Dianabol, it is a 17 alpha alkylated oral steroid originally that was designed to be administered orally in the recent years, and unlike the old age of bodybuilding, things like anadrol or Dianabol that were like historically oral compounds have been turned into injectables for obvious reasons, and this is because of the liver toxicity. And this can offer a lot of benefits, of course, namely to circumvent the liver toxicity that a lot of these steroids basically have. They can be very liver toxic if administered orally. Things like Dianabol and anadrol and all these different things. So definitely the injectable route can offer a lot of health benefits for people that want to continue to use these compounds while not worrying about their liver toxicity and even other side effects. So when you talk about using these compounds in an injectable way, first of all, we're going to talk about either it's going to be intramuscularly or it's going to be subcutaneously. Now, I'm just going to mention a bunch of points here before I get into the efficacy of Dianabol when administered subcutaneously, which is a topic that definitely needs a lot more research and needs a lot more measuring of the effects of Dianabol when administered subcutaneously versus intramuscularly versus orally versus even sublingually. So you can basically see the peak concentrations in the blood and the onset Tmax and Cmax and things like that. There has to be a study done to basically measure all these things, but I'm just going to make some conclusions based on the studies that we have as far as different compounds and as far as the subcutaneous and the intramuscular route. And number one, we have studies comparing the effects of certain testosterone esters in men. So it can be derived through a bunch of studies that long esters are more anabolic than short esters. And this is shown in a study that I've mentioned, which is basically a study that was done, I think, in the 1950s, and I'm going to put a link to all of these and screenshots. And it tested different esters of testosterone, and it found that the duration or the nitrogen retention was proportional or was correlated with the ester of the compound. So, for example, testosterone enanthate would result in a total nitrogen retention of 1.76 grams per day, and propionate only 1.02 grams per day. So if the nitrogen retention of a compound was higher than another compound, then definitely we can derive from that the anabolic activity of the compound that has higher nitrogen retention is higher than the compound that has a lower nitrogen retention. Not to mention the anabolic activity was basically prolonged with the esters that are longer. Okay, so this is just one point to make here, and I'm gonna read. Let me see here if I can find the study, and I can actually read this study right here, which I had tried to dig up this study for a very long time to basically try to find information about that. And it basically said figure 1 also shows that total retention of nitrogen increased in direct proportion to the duration of the effectiveness of the compound. Okay, so here you see that it increased in direct proportion to the duration of effectiveness of the compound. So the longer compounds had more nitrogen retention. And this was up to a point, okay? Then decreased in case of the most long-acting compound. So basically, we can see that here, that definitely there is some sort of evidence that the longer esters would be more anabolic in some sense. The second point is that the one I'm going to talk about is the short ester anabolic capacity injected intramuscularly versus subcutaneously. So here, that's a very, very crucial point. And what you will find is that short esters are basically slowed down in their anabolic capacity by subcutaneous administration. And the reason that this is a point that is very crucial to understand is that, I mean, the whole point of short esters is that they're designed to achieve faster peak concentrations in the blood, and in many times they rely on that faster peak to achieve some of their anabolic capability. So when you administer these compounds through the subcutaneous route, you basically slow down completely the absorption rate or the peak concentration of these short ester compounds, right? And there are a bunch of points here, which is subcutaneous injections tend to release compounds more slowly than intramuscular injections. With a short ester, like testosterone propionate for example, this slower absorption could somewhat prolong its release and reduce the sharp peak typically associated with, for example, intramuscular administration. And at the same time, it's unlikely to create the same extended release profile as a long ester. Instead, it would be a slightly smoothed out peak. Okay. Now, while the sub-Q administration might flatten the peak somewhat, it still can clear the body relatively quickly. The reduced peak could mean less pronounced anabolic effects per dose. Okay, short esters rely on frequent dosing for steady blood levels. All right. This is in contrast with the long ester, which basically are designed to release over an extended period of time due to their larger molecular structure, which slows breakdown. So basically, even with the sub-Q administration, a short ester won't match this prolonged release since its half-life remains inherently shorter. Now, this is all subject to basically testing, right? So an experiment has to be done where all these things have to be tested. As now, we're just making conclusions, or I'm making and driving conclusions with the information that I have available to me through other studies. So if two esters of, let's say, testosterone, a long ester like enanthate or cypionate versus propionate, a short ester like propionate, are injected subcutaneously, which would have more anabolic effect, provided they're both of them are injected subcutaneously, based on the data based on what we conclude here, and this could be subject to further studies, and it can be subject to a different opinion. But based on what we can derive from here is that the short ester would have a lower anabolic capability injected subcutaneously versus a long ester like testosterone enanthate. Okay, and this is basically something that can be derived from a lot of the data through a lot of the studies that we can basically mention here. It's also understood that when there is a study here also I'm going to be linking that compared intramuscular to subcutaneous administration, and he found that peak blood levels were reached within 3.3 days with intramuscular administration, and with I think over 8 days with subcutaneous administration. So this is something also to keep in mind. Number 3 is earlier peak of intramuscular versus subcutaneous injection. Intramuscular injection of soluble insulin led to an earlier peak of metabolic action when compared to subcutaneous. This study was done on insulin, and it was done on intramuscular versus subcutaneous injection when it comes to insulin. Now, the carrier oils and the water-based versus oil-based, and what oil, that's a completely different story, and that would change, definitely that would change a lot the things like the availability or the absorption when it's administered subcutaneously versus intramuscularly. This would change things a lot too. If the compound is basically is in a water or it's in an oil, and what type of oil, that also would change things a lot. Now, another point I want to mention, which is number 4, is that peak testosterone levels were higher when he compared an intramuscular group at a 3 months follow-up than a subcutaneous group. Okay, so these things and are just things that I'm mentioning overall to provide some data through which I'm going to conclude what I'm going to conclude about Dianabol right now, which is basically the Dianabol subcutaneous injection. Now, Dianabol is a non-esterified compound, right? So when we talked about the short esters of testosterone administered subcutaneously versus intramuscularly and the effects of both, we talked about short esters versus long esters. Now, Dianabol, it's a non-esterified compound at all. So when a non-esterified compound like Dianabol is injected subcutaneously, not even having an ester actually can change things completely. So with something like Dianabol, a bunch of things have to be taken into consideration, right? Number 1, absorption rate. And we talked about this before, that sub-Q injections tend to have a slower absorption rate compared to intramuscular injections. Injection formulation, which is the fact that injectable Dianabol usually comes in an oil-based solution. Some of these oils may not be ideal for sub-Q injections, and it can cause irritation and local tissue reaction that are basically not very favorable, right? Now, also blood levels and stability. Dianabol has a short half-life, so maintaining stable blood levels could be more challenging with a sub-Q injection compared to oral administration, which is faster and more predictable, right? As far as the anabolic effect, which is basically what we're concerned with here, the ability to build muscle, would oral Dianabol or would subcutaneous Dianabol injections have the same ability to build muscle as oral Dianabol injections or as even intramuscular Dianabol injection? Now, there are some things, okay, that we need to mention here. Knowing that more research needs to be done, and nobody knows exactly because we have not compared the results between 2 people on the same dosage of Dianabol, one administered subcutaneously and one administered orally or intramuscularly. And unless exact research is done, we can't really say for sure. But we can just make some, you can call intelligent assumptions about the whole issue, which is the reason maybe subcutaneous injections of Dianabol are unlikely to build as much muscle or have as much anabolic capability as intramuscular administration or as even oral administration is, number 1, the slower absorption rate and reduced peaks. Dianabol's anabolic effects are partly driven by rapid peaks in blood levels. Oral administration achieves those peaks quickly, but subcutaneous injections typically result in a slower, more gradual release, which may not reach the concentrations needed for maximum muscle building. Right? 2 is very short half-life. Dianabol has a very short half-life, about 3 to 6 hours, so quick absorption is essential to maintain effective blood levels. The same thing, subcutaneous injections with their slower release would likely mean lower blood concentrations over time, potentially reducing the anabolic impact. Okay? The bioavailability and metabolic pathways. Okay? Although subcutaneous administration could slightly improve bioavailability by avoiding some liver metabolism, the slow release profile might prevent the achievement of optimal muscle building effects. The body's use of the compound may not be as effective without the rapid availability that oral or intramuscular administration provides. Now, subcu, like I said, much more research needs to be done about subcutaneous injections of specifically Dianabol, because we have the only really way to know for sure is to perform a study, and no study has been done, and as far as I know, on any form of injectable Dianabol. Most of the studies that I have read, unless I'm not aware of some studies, have been on oral Dianabol. So one more thing that we're going to talk about here, for muscle growth, especially for Dianabol, is a compound that is designed to peak very fast as far as its blood concentration levels. So reaching a high enough concentration quickly can be more actually important for building muscle than sustaining a lower level for an extended period. Okay? The body may not achieve that initial shock, which is basically the fast peaks of Dianabol from a sub-Q injection, which often enhances protein synthesis and muscle repair processes. And this is something that is very specifically to something like Dianabol. And we talked about the short and long esters as well. And a lot of the stuff here that we're talking about relates to how Dianabol is designed and how it's actually supposed to work, okay? Because specifically for Dianabol and for a lot of these very short acting compounds, Dianabol acts by binding to androgen receptors, which initiates protein synthesis in muscle tissue. Now, the higher blood concentrations allow it to interact more effectively with these receptors, activating anabolic pathways. A lot of the way that it works is that reaching high concentrations quickly tends to enhance these pathways more than slower, low-level exposure. And this is for the compounds like Dianabol that were designed to peak very fast in the blood and reach high levels quickly, right? Basically, the concept of peak exposure is supported by anabolic response studies in which a frequent dosing of short-acting steroids optimizes muscle gains compared to a lower-level exposure, okay? And many bodybuilders take Dianabols multiple times per day to maintain higher plasma levels and produce the anabolic responses desired for muscle growth. So these are just some basically assumptions, okay, on why subcutaneous Dianabol may not have the same anabolic effects as oral or intramuscular Dianabol when it comes exactly to muscle building capability. Now, with that being said, of course, more studies need to be done, and an accurate scientific comparison needs to be done on oral versus injectable versus intramuscular Dianabol to be able to quantify for sure the anabolic results and the muscle building capability of Dianabol administered through these different routes of administration. Now, in a different video or in another video, I might list some experiences of people who had experience with Dianabol subcutaneously, and just their overall feelings and overall measurements as far as muscle growth and strength increase in the gym, and different metrics, to be able to have a better idea of this issue of basically if Dianabol administered subcutaneously has the same anabolic and muscle building capability as Dianabol when it's administered orally or intramuscularly or even sublingually, which is one of the ways that people use it. So that being said, check out the blog on perfecthumanx.com. Always strive to achieve the perfect version of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.